Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted.
No Such Thing as a Vampire by Richard Matheson. In the early autumn, Madame Alexis Guerilla awoke one morning to a sense of utmost torpor. For more than a minute she lay inertly on her back, her dark eyes staring upward. How wasted she felt. It seemed as if her limbs were sheathed in lead. Perhaps she was ill. Petrie must examine her and see. Drawing in a faint breath, she pressed up slowly on an elbow. As she did, her nightdress slid, rustling to her waist. How had it become unfastened? She wondered, looking down at herself. Quite suddenly, Madame Guerilla began to scream. In the breakfast room, Dr. Petre Guerilla looked up, startled, from his morning paper. In an instant, he had pushed his chair back, slung his napkin on the table, and was rushing for the hallway. He dashed across his carpeted breadth and mounted the staircase 2 steps at a time. It was a near hysterical Madame Guerilla he found sitting on the edge of her bed, looking down in horror at her breasts. Across the dilated whiteness of them, a smear of blood lay drying. Dr. Guerilla dismissed the upstairs maid, who stood frozen in the open doorway, gaping at her mistress. He locked the door and hurried to his wife. "Petrie," she gasped. Gently, he helped her lie back across the blood-stained pillow. "Petrie, what is it?" she begged. "Lie still, my dear." His practiced hands moved in swift search over her breast. Suddenly his breath choked off. Pressing aside her head, he stared down dumbly at the pinprick lacerations on her neck, the ribbons of tacky blood that twisted downward from them. "My throat," Alexis said. "No, it's just a—" Dr. Guerilla did not complete the sentence. He knew exactly what it was. Madame Guerilla began to tremble. "Oh, my God," she said. Dr. Guerilla rose and found her to the wash basin. Pouring in water, he returned to his wife and washed away the blood. The wound was clearly visible now, 2 tiny punctures close to the jugular. A grimacing Dr. Guerilla touched the mounds of inflamed tissue in which they lay. As he did, his wife groaned terribly and turned her face away. "Now listen to me," he said, his voice apparently calm. "We will not succumb immediately to superstition. Do you hear? There are any number of—" "I'm going to die," she said. "Alexis, do you hear me?" He caught her harshly by the shoulders. She turned her head and stared at him with vacant eyes. "You know what it is," she said. Dr. Guerilla swallowed. He could still taste coffee in his mouth. "I know what it appears to be," he said, "and we shall not ignore the possibility. However, I'm going to die," she said. "Alexis," Dr. Guerilla took her hand and gripped it fiercely. "You shall not be taken from me," he said. Solta was a village of some 1,000 inhabitants, situated in the foothills of Romania's Bihor mountain. It was a place of dark traditions. People hearing the bay of distant wolves would cross themselves without a thought. Children would gather garlic buds as other children gather flowers, bringing them home for the windows. On every door there was a painted cross, at every throat a metal one. Dread of the vampire's blighting was as normal as the dread of fatal sickness. It was always in the air. Dr. Guerilla thought about that as he bolted shut the window of Alexi's room. Far off, molten twilight hung above the mountains. Soon it would be dark again. Soon the citizens of Solta would be barricaded in their garlic-reeking houses. He had no doubt that every soul of them knew exactly what had happened to his wife. Already the cook and upstairs maid were pleading for discharge. Only the inflexible discipline of the butler, Carrel, kept them at their jobs. Soon even that would not suffice. Before the horror of the vampire, reason fled. He'd seen the evidence of that very morning, when he ordered Madame's room stripped to the walls in search for rodents or venomous insects. The servants had moved about the room as if on a floor of eggs, their eyes more white than pupils, their fingers twitching constantly to their crosses. They had known full well no rodents or insects would be found, and Gurrea had known it. Still, he'd raged at them for their timidity, succeeding only in frightening them further. He turned from the window with a smile. "There now," he said, "nothing alive will enter this room tonight." He caught himself immediately, seeing the flare of terror in her eyes. "Nothing at all will enter," he amended. Alexis lay motionless on her bed, one pale hand at her breast, clutching at the worn silver cross she'd taken from her jewel box. She hadn't worn it since he'd given her the diamond-studded one when they were married. How typical of her village background, that in this moment of dread she should seek protection from the unadorned cross of her church. She was such a child. Gurrea smiled down gently at her. "You won't be needing that, my dear," he said. "You'll be safe tonight." Her fingers tightened on the crucifix. "No, no, wear it if you will," he said. "I only meant that I'll be at your side all night. You'll stay with me?" He sat on the bed and held her hand. "Do you think I'd leave you for a moment?" he said. 30 minutes later she was sleeping. Dr. Gurrea drew a chair beside the bed and seated himself. Removing his glasses, he massaged the bridge of his nose with the thumb and forefinger of his left hand. Then, sighing, he began to watch his wife. How incredibly beautiful she was. Dr. Gurrea's breath grew strained. "There is no such thing as a vampire," he whispered to himself. There was a distant pounding. Dr. Gurrea muttered in his sleep, his fingers twitching. The pounding increased. An agitated voice came swirling from the darkness. "Doctor!" it called. Gurrea snapped awake. For a moment he looked confusedly towards the locked door. "Dr. Gurrea," demanded Corral. "What? Is everything all right?" "Yes, everything is—" Dr. Gurrea cried out hoarsely, springing for the bed. Alexis' nightdress had been torn away again. A hideous dew of blood covered her chest and neck. Corral shook his head. "Bolted windows cannot hold away the creature, sir," he said. He stood, tall and lean, beside the kitchen table, on which lay the cluster of silver he'd been polishing when Gurrea had entered. "The creature has the power to make of itself a vapor, which can pass through any opening, however small," he said. "But the cross!" cried Gurrea. It was still at her throat, untouched, except by blood. He added in a sickened voice, "This I cannot understand," said Corral grimly. "The cross should have protected her." "But why did I see nothing?" "You are drugged by its mephitic presence," Corral said. "Count yourself fortunate that you were not also attacked." "I do not count myself fortunate." Dr. Gurrea struck his palm, a look of anguish on his face. "What am I to do, Corral?" he asked. "Hang garlic," said the old man. "Hang it at the windows, at the doors. Let there be no opening unblocked by garlic." Gurrea nodded distractedly. "Never in my life have I seen this thing," he said brokenly. "Now, my own wife?" "I have seen it," said Corral. "I have, myself, put to its rest one of these monsters from the grave." "The stake?" Gurrea looked revolted. The old man nodded slowly. Gurrea swallowed. "Pray God, you may put this one to rest as well," he said. "Petre?" She was weaker now, her voice a toneless murmur. Gurrea bent over her. "Yes, my dear," he said. "It will come again tonight," she said. "No." He shook his head determinedly. "It cannot come. The garlic will repel it." "My cross didn't," she said. "You didn't." "The garlic will," he said. "And see," he pointed at the bedside table. "I have black coffee brought for me. I won't sleep tonight." She closed her eyes, a look of pain across her sallow features. "I don't want to die," she said. "Please don't let me die, Petrie." "You won't," he said. "I promise you. The monsters shall be destroyed." Alexis shuddered feebly. "But if there is no way, Petrie," she murmured. "There is always a way," he answered. Outside, the darkness, cold and heavy, pressed around the house. Dr. Gurrea took his place beside the bed and began to wait. Within the hour, Alexis slipped into a heavy slumber. Gently, Dr. Gurrea released her hand and poured himself a cup of steaming coffee. As he sipped it, hotly bitter, he looked around the room. Door locked, windows bolted, every opening sealed with garlic, the cross at Alexis' throat. He nodded slowly to himself. It will work, he thought. The monster would be thwarted. He sat there waiting, listening to his breath. Dr. Gurrea was at the door before the second knock. "Michael," he embraced the younger man. "Dear Michael, I was sure you'd come." Anxiously he ushered Dr. Verres toward his studio. Outside, darkness was just falling. Where on earth are all the people of the village? Asked Varys. I swear I didn't see a soul as I rode in. Huddling terror-stricken in their houses, Guriah said, and all my servants with them save for one. And who is that? My butler Corell, Guriah answered. He didn't answer the door because he's sleeping, poor fellow. He is very old, and he's been doing the work of 5. He gripped Varys' arm. Dear Michael, he said, you have no idea how glad I am to see you. Varys looked at him worriedly. I came as soon as I received your message, he said. And I appreciate it, Guriah said. I know how long and how hard a ride it is from Cluj. What's wrong? Asked Varys. Your letter only said... Quickly, Guriah told him what had happened in the past week. I tell you, Michael, I stumble at the brink of madness, he said. Nothing works. Garlic, wolfsbane, crosses, mirrors, running water, useless. No, don't say it. This isn't superstition nor imagination. This is happening. A vampire is destroying her. Each day she sinks yet deeper into that deadly torpor from which... Guriah clenched his hands. And yet I cannot understand it, he muttered brokenly. I simply cannot understand it. Come, sit, Dr. Varys pressed the older man into a chair, grimacing at the pallor of him. Nervously his fingers sought for Guriah's pulse beat. Never mind me, protested Guriah. It's Alexei's. We must help. He pressed a sudden trembling hand across his eyes. Yet how? He said. He made no resistance as the younger man undid his collar and examined his neck. You too, said Varys, sickened. What's that matter? Guriah clutched at the younger man's hand. My friend, my dearest friend, he said. Tell me that it is not I. Do I do this hideous thing to her? Varys looked confounded. You? He said, but... I know, said Guriah. I myself have been attacked. Yet nothing follows, Michael. What breed of horror is this which cannot be impeded? From what unholy place does it emerge? I've had the countryside examined foot by foot, every graveyard ransacked, every crypt inspected. There is no house within the village that has not been subjected to my search. I tell you, Michael, there is nothing. Yet there is something which assaults us nightly, draining us of life. The village is engulfed by terror, and I as well. I never see this creature, never hear it, yet every morning I find my beloved wife. Varys' face was drawn and pallid now. He stared intently at the older man. What am I to do, my friend? Pleaded Guriah. How am I to save her? Varys had no answer. How long has she been like this? Asked Varys. He could not remove his stricken gaze from the whiteness of Alexa's face. For days, said Guriah. The retrogression has been constant. Dr. Varys put down Alexei's flaccid hand. Why did you not tell me sooner? He asked. I thought the matter could be handled, Guriah answered faintly. I know now that it cannot. Varys shuddered. But surely, he began. There is nothing left to be done, said Guriah. Everything has been tried. Everything. He stumbled to the window and stared out bleakly into the deepening night. And now it comes again, he murmured, and we are helpless before it. Not helpless, Petrie. Varys forced a cheering smile to his lips and laid his hand upon the older man's shoulder. I will watch her tonight. It's useless. Not at all, my friend, said Varys nervously. And now you must sleep. I will not leave her, said Guriah. But you need rest. I cannot leave, said Guriah. I will not be separated from her. Varys nodded. Of course, he said. We will share the hours of watching then. Guriah sighed. We can try, he said, but there was no sound of hope in his voice. Some 20 minutes later returned with an urn of steaming coffee, which was barely possible to smell through the heavy mist of garlic fumes which hung in the air. Trudging to the bed, Guriah set down the tray. Dr. Varys had drawn a chair up beside the bed. I'll watch first, he said. You sleep, Petrie. It would do no good to try, said Guriah. He held a cup between the spigot and the coffee gurgled out like smoking ebony. Thank you, murmured Varys as the cup was handed to him. Guriah nodded once and drew himself a cupful before he sat. I do not know what will happen to Sulta if this creature is not destroyed, he said. The people are paralyzed by terror. Has it been elsewhere in the village? Varys asked him. Guriah sighed exhaustedly. Why need it go elsewhere? He said. It is finding all it craves within these walls. He stared despondently at Alexis. When we are gone, he said, It will go elsewhere. The people know that and are waiting for it. Varys set down his cup and rubbed his eyes. It seems impossible, he said, that we, practitioners of a science, should be unable to... What can science effect against it, said Garea? Science will not even admit its existence. We could bring into this very room the foremost scientists of the world, and they would say, my friends, you have been deluded. There is no vampire. All is mere trickery. Garea stopped and looked intently at the younger man. He said, Michael? Varys' breath was slow and heavy. Putting down his cup of untouched coffee, Garea stood and moved to where Varys sat, slumped in his chair. He pressed back an eyelid, looked down briefly at the sightless pupil, then withdrew his hand. The drug was quick, he thought, and most effective. Varys would be insensible for more than time enough. Moving to the closet, Garea drew down his bag and carried it to the bed. He tore Alexa's nightdress from her upper body, and within seconds had drawn another syringe full of her blood. This would be the last withdrawal, fortunately. Staunching the blood, he took the syringe to Varys and emptied it into the young man's mouth, smearing it across his lips and teeth. That done, he strode to the door and unlocked it. Returning to Varys, he raised and carried him into the hall. Corell would not awaken. A small amount of opium in his food had seen to that. Garea labored down the steps beneath the weight of Varys' body. In the darkest corner of the cellar, a wooden casket waited for the younger man. There he would lie until the following morning, when the distraught Dr. Pete de Garia would, with sudden inspiration, order Corell to search the attic and cellar on the remote, nay, fantastic possibility that... 10 minutes later, Garea was back in the bedroom checking Alexi's pulse beat. It was active enough. She would survive. The pain and torturing horror she had undergone would be punishment enough for her. As for Varys, Dr. Garea smiled in pleasure. For the first time since Alexis and he had returned from Cluj at the end of the summer, dear spirits in heaven, would it not be sheer enchantment to watch old Corell drive a stake through Michael Varys' damned cuckolding heart. The Love Letter by Jack Finney. I've heard of secret drawers and old desks, of course. Who hasn't? But the day I bought my desk, I wasn't thinking of secret drawers, and I know very well I didn't have any least premonition or feel of mystery about it. I spotted in the window of a second-hand store near my apartment, went in to look it over, and the proprietor told me where he got it. It came from one of the last of the big old mid-Victorian houses in Brooklyn. They were tearing it down over on Brock Place, a few blocks away, and he bought the desk along with some other furniture, dishes, glassware, light fixtures, and so on. But it didn't stir my imagination particularly. I never wondered or cared who might have used it long ago. I bought it and lugged it home because it was cheap and because it was small. A legless little wall desk that I fastened to my living room wall with heavy screws directly into the studding. I'm 24 years old, tall and thin, and I live in Brooklyn to save money and work in Manhattan to make it. When you're 24 and a bachelor, you usually figure you'll be married before much longer. And since they tell me that takes money, I'm reasonably ambitious and bring work home from the office every once in a while. And maybe every couple of weeks or so I write a letter to my folks in Florida. So I'd be needing a desk. There's no table in my phone booth kitchenette, and I've been trying to work at a wobbly little end table, but I couldn't get my knees under it. So I bought the desk one Saturday afternoon and spent an hour or more fastening it to the wall. It was after 6 when I finished. I had a date that night, and so I had time to stand and admire it for only a minute or so. It was made of heavy wood with a slant top, like a kid's school desk, and with the same sort of space underneath to put things into. But the back of it rose a good 2 feet above the desktop, and was full of pigeonholes like an old-style roll-top desk. Beneath the pigeonholes was a row of 3 brass-knobbed little drawers. It was all pretty ordinate. The drawer ends carved, some fancy scrollwork extending up over the back and out from the sides to help brace it against the wall. I dragged the chair up, sat down at the desk to try it for height, then got showered, shaved, and dressed and went over to Manhattan to pick up my date. I'm trying to be honest about what happened, and I'm convinced that includes the way I felt when I got home around 2 or 2:30 that morning. I'm certain that what happened wouldn't have happened at all if I'd felt any other way. I had a good enough time that evening. We'd gone to an early movie that wasn't too bad, then had dinner, a drink or so, and some dancing afterward. And the girl, Roberta Haig, is pretty nice. Bright, pleasant, good-looking. But walking home from the subway, the Brooklyn streets quiet and deserted, it occurred to me that while I'd probably see her again, I didn't really care whether I did or not. And I wondered, as I often had lately, whether there was something wrong with me, whether I'd ever meet a girl I desperately wanted to be with. The only way a man can get married, it seems to me. So when I stepped into my apartment, I knew I wasn't going to feel like sleep for a while. I was restless, half irritated for no good reason, and I took off my coat and yanked down my tie, wondering whether I wanted a drink or some coffee. Then I'd half forgotten about it. I saw the desk I'd bought that afternoon, and I walked over and sat down at it, thoroughly examining it for the first time. I lifted the top and stared down into the empty space underneath. Lowering the top, I reached into one of the pigeonholes, and my hand and shirt cuff came out streaked with old dust. The holes were a good foot deep. I pulled open one of the little brass knob drawers, and there was a shred of paper in one of its corners, nothing else. I pulled the drawer all the way out and studied its construction, turning it in my hand. It was solidly made, beautifully mortised little thing. Then I pushed my hand into the drawer opening. It went in to about the middle of my hand before my fingertips touched the back. There was nothing in there. For a few minutes I just sat at the desk thinking vaguely that I could write a letter to my folks. Then it suddenly occurred to me that the little drawer in my hand was only half a foot long, while the pigeonholes just above the drawer extended a good foot back. Showing my hand into the opening again, exploring with my fingertips, I found a tiny grooved indentation and pulled out the secret drawer, which lay in back of the first. For an instant I was excited at the glimpse of paper inside. Then I felt a stab of disappointment as I saw what they were. They were a little sheaf of folded writing paper, plain white but yellowed with age at the edges, and the sheets were all blank. There were 3 or 4 blank envelopes to match, and underneath them a small round glass bottle of ink, and because it had been upside down, the cork remaining moist and tight in the bottle mouth. A good third of the ink had remained unevaporated still. Beside the bottle lay a plain black wooden pen holder, the pen point reddish black with old ink. There was nothing else in the drawer. And then, putting the things back into the drawer, I felt the slight extra thickness of one blank envelope, saw that it was sealed, and I ripped it open to find the letter inside. The folded paper opened stiffly, the crease permanent with age, and even before I saw the date, I knew the letter was old. The handwriting was obviously feminine and beautifully clear. It's called Spencerian, isn't it? The letters perfectly formed and very ornate, the capitals especially being a whirl of dainty curlicues. The ink was rust black. The date at the top of the page was May 14th, 1882, and reading it I saw that it was a love letter. It began, "Dearest, Papa, Mama, Willie, and Cook are long retired and to sleep. Now the night far advanced, the house silent, I alone remain awake, at last free to speak to you as I choose. Yes, I am willing to say it. Heart of mine, I crave your bold glance. I long for the tender warmth of your look. I welcome your ardency and prize it. For what else should these be taken but sweet tribute to me?" I smiled a little. It was hard to believe that people had once expressed themselves in elaborate phrasings of this kind, but they had. The letter continued, and I wondered why it had never been sent. "Dear one, do not ever change your ways. Never address me other than with that consideration my utterances should deserve. If I be foolish and whimsical, deride me sweetly if you will. But if I speak with seriousness, respond always with what care you deem my thoughts worthy. For, oh my beloved, I am sick to death of the indulgent smile and tolerant glance with which a woman's fancies are met, as I am repelled by the false gentleness and nicety of matter which too often ill conceal the wantonness they attempt to mask. I speak of the man I am to marry. If you could but save me from that. But you cannot. You are everything I prize, warmly and honestly ardent, respectful in heart as well as in manner, true and loving. You are as I wish you to be, for you exist only in my mind. But, figment though you are, and though I shall never see your like, you are more dear to me than he to whom I am betrothed. I think of you constantly. I dream of you. I speak with you in my mind and heart. Would you existed outside them? Sweetheart, good night. Dream of me too. With all my love, I am your Helen. At the bottom of the page, as I'm sure she'd been taught in school, was written, Miss Helen Elizabeth Worley, Brooklyn, New York. As I stared down at it now, I was no longer smiling at this cry from the heart in the middle of a long ago night. The night is a strange time when you're alone in it, the rest of your world asleep. If I'd found that letter in the daytime, I'd have smiled and shown it to a few friends, then forgotten it. But alone here now, a window partly open, a cool late-at-night freshness stirring the quiet air, it was impossible to think of the girl who had written this letter as a very old lady, or maybe long since dead. As I read her words, she seemed real and alive to me, sitting, or so I pictured her, pen in hand at this desk, in a long white old-fashioned dress, her young hair piled on top of her head, in the dead of night like this, here in Brooklyn, almost in sight of where I now sat. My heart went out to her as I stared down at her secret, hopeless appeal against the world and time she lived in. I'm trying to explain why I answered that letter. There in the silence of a timeless spring night, it seemed natural enough to uncork the old bottle, pick up the pen beside it, and then, spreading a sheet of yellowing old notepaper on the desktop, to begin to write. I felt that I was communicating with a still living young woman when I wrote, Helen, I've just read the letter in the secret drawer of your desk, and I wish I knew how I could possibly help you. I can't tell what you might think of me if there were a way I could reach you, but you are someone I am certain I would like to know. I hope you are beautiful, but you needn't be. You're a girl I could like, and maybe ardently, and if I did, I promise you I'd be true and loving. Do the best you can, Helen Elizabeth Worley, in the time and place you are. I can't reach you or help you, but I'll think of you, and maybe I'll dream of you too. Yours, Jake Belknap. I was grinning a little sheepishly as I signed my name, knowing I'd read through what I'd written it, then crumple the old sheet and throw it away, but I was glad I'd written it, and I didn't throw it away. Still caught in the feeling of the warm, silent night, it suddenly seemed to me that throwing my letter away would turn the writing of it into a meaningless and foolish thing, though maybe what I did seems more foolish still. I folded the paper, put it into one of the envelopes, and sealed it. Then I dipped the pen into the old ink and wrote Miss Helen Worley on the face of the envelope. I suppose this can't be explained. You have to have been where I was and felt as I did to understand it. But I wanted to mail that letter. I simply quit examining my feelings and quit trying to be rational. I was suddenly determined to complete what I'd begun, just as far as I was able to go. My parents sold their old home in New Jersey when my father retired 2 years ago, and now they live in Florida and enjoy it. And when my mother cleared out the old house I grew up in, she packed up and mailed me a huge package of useless things I was glad to have. There was class photographs dating from grammar school through college, old books I'd read as a kid, Boy Scout pins, a mass of junk of that sort, including a stamp collection I'd had in grade school. Now I found these things on my hot closet shelf in the box they'd come in, and I found my old stamp album. It's funny how things can stick in your mind over the years. Standing at the open closet door, I turned the pages of that beat-up old album directly to the stamps I remembered buying from another kid with 75 cents I'd earned cutting grass. There they lay, lightly fastened to the page with a little gummed-up paper hinge, a pair of 2 mint-condition 2-cent United States stamps issued in 1869, and standing there in the hallway looking down at them, I once again got something of a thrill I'd had as a kid when I acquired them. It's a handsome stamp, square in shape, with an ornate border and a tiny engraving in the center, a rider on a galloping post-horse, and for all I knew they might have been worth a fair amount of money, but now, especially an unseparated pair of 2 stamps. But back at the desk I pulled one of them loose, tearing carefully through the perforation, licking the back, and fastened it to the fainting yellow old envelope. I thought no further than that. By now I suppose I was in almost a kind of trance. I shoved the old ink bottle and pen into a hip pocket, picked up my letter, and walked out of my apartment. Brock Place, 3 blocks away, was deserted when I reached it. The parked cars motionless at the curb, the high late moonlight softening the lines of the big concrete block supermarket at the corner. Then as I walked on, my letter in my hand, there stood the old house, just past the little shoe repair shop. It stood far back from the broken cast-iron fence in the center of it, wide, weed-grown lot, black etched in the moonlight, and I stopped on the walk and stood staring up at it. The high windowed old roof was gone, the interior nearly gutted, the yard strewn with splintered boards and great chunks of torn plaster. The windows and doors were all removed, the openings hollow in the clear wash of light, but the high old walls, last of all to go, still stood, tall and dignified in their old-fashioned strength and outmoded charm. Then I walked through the opening where a gate had once hung, up the cracked and weed-grown brick pavement toward the wide old porch, and there, on one of the ornate fluted posts, I saw the house number, deeply and elaborately carved into the old wood. At the wide flat porch rail leading down to the walk, I brought out my ink and pen and copied the number carefully onto my envelope. 972 I printed under the name of the girl who had once lived there. Brock Place, Brooklyn, New York. Then I turned toward the street again, my envelope in my hand. There was a mailbox at the next corner, and I stopped beside it. But to drop this letter into that box, knowing in advance that it could only go to the dead letter office, would again, I couldn't help feeling, turn the writing of it into an empty, meaningless act. And after a moment I walked on past the box, crossed the street and turned right, suddenly knowing exactly where I was going. I walked 4 blocks through the night, passing a hack stand with a single cab, its driver asleep with his arms and head cradled on the wheel, passing a night watchman sitting on a standpipe protruding from the building wall, smoking a pipe. He nodded as I passed, and I nodded in response. I turned left at the next corner, walked half a block more, then turned up onto the worn stone steps of the Worcester postal substation. It must easily be one of the oldest postal substations in the borough, built, I suppose, not much later than during the decade following the Civil War, and I can't imagine that the inside has changed much at all. The floor is marble, the ceiling high, the woodwork dark and carved. The outer lobby is open at all times, as are post office lobbies everywhere, and as I pushed through the old swinging doors I saw that it was deserted. Somewhere behind the opaque blind windows a light burned dimly far in the rear of the post office, and I had an impression of subdued activity back there. But the lobby itself was dim and silent, and as I walked across the worn stone of its floor I knew I was seeing all around me precisely what Brooklynites had been seeing for no telling how many generations long dead. The post office has always seemed an institution of vague mystery to me, an ancient and worn but still functioning mechanism that is not operated, but only tended by each succeeding generation of men to come along. It is a place where occasionally plainly addressed letters with clearly written return addresses go astray and are lost, to end up no one knows where, and for reasons impossible to discover, as the postal employees from whom you inquired will tell you, and its vague air of mystery for me is made up of stories. Well, you've read them too, from time to time, the odd little stories in your newspaper. A letter bearing a postmark of 1906, written half a century ago, is delivered today, simply because inexplicably it arrived at some post office along with the other mail, with no explanation from anyone now alive. Or sometimes it's a postcard of greeting from the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, maybe. And once, tragically, as I remember reading, it was an acceptance of a proposal of marriage offered in 1901 and received today, a lifetime too late, by the man who made it and who married someone else and is now a grandfather. I pushed the worn brass plate open, dropped my letter into the silent blackness of the slot, and it disappeared forever with no sound. Then I turned and left to walk home, with a feeling of fulfillment, of having done at least everything I possibly could in response to the silent cry for help I'd found in the secrecy of the old desk. Next morning I felt the way almost anyone might. Standing at the bathroom mirror, shaving, remembering what I'd done the night before, I grinned, feeling foolish but at the same time secretly pleased with myself. I was glad I'd written and solemnly mailed that letter, and now I realized why I put no return address on the envelope. I didn't want it to come forlornly back to me with no such person, or whatever the phrase is, stamped on the envelope. There had once been such a girl, and last night she still existed for me, and I didn't want to see my letter to her, rubber stamp scribbled on and unopened, to prove that there no longer was. I was terrifically busy all the next week. I worked for a wholesale grocery concern. We got a big new account, a chain of supermarkets, and that meant extra work for everyone. More often than not, I had lunch at my desk in the office and worked several evenings beside. I had dates the 2 evenings I was free. On Friday afternoon, I was at the main public library in Manhattan, at Fifth Avenue and 42nd, copying statistics from half a dozen trade publications for a memorandum I'd been assigned to write over the weekend on the new account. Late in the afternoon, the man sitting beside me at the big reading room table closed his book, stowed away his glasses, picked up his hat from the table, and left. I sat back in my chair, glancing at my watch. Then I looked over at the book he'd left on the table. It was a big one-volume pictorial history of New York, put out by Columbia University, and I dragged it over and began leafing through it. I skimmed over the first sections on colonial and pre-colonial New York pretty quickly, but when the old sketches and drawings began giving way to actual photographs, I turned the pages more slowly. I leafed past the first photos, taken around the mid-century and then past those of the Civil War period. But when I reached the first photograph of the 1870s, it was a view of Fifth Avenue in 1871. I began reading the captions under each one. I knew it would be too much to hope to find a photograph of Brock Place in Helen Worley's time, especially, and of course I didn't. But I knew there'd surely be photographs taken in Brooklyn during the 1880s, and a few pages further on I found what I'd hoped I might. In clear, sharp detail and beautifully reproduced lay a half-page photograph of a street less than a quarter mile from Brock Place. And staring down at it there in the library, I knew that Helen Worley must have often walked along this very sidewalk. Varney Street, 1881, the caption said, a typical Brooklyn residential street of the period. Varney Street today. I walk 2 blocks of it every night, coming home from work, is a wasteland. I pass 4 cinder-packed used car lots, a shabby concrete garage, the dead earth in front of it littered with rusting car parts and old tires, a half dozen or so nearly paintless boarding houses, one with a soiled card in its window reading massage. It's a nondescript, joyless street, and it's impossible to believe that there had ever been a tree on its entire length. But there has been. There in sharp black and white, in the book on the table before me lay Varney Street, 1881, and from the wide grass-covered parkways between the cut stone curb and sidewalks, the thick old long-gone trees rose high on both sides to meet, intertwine, and roof the wide streets with green. The photograph had been taken apparently from the street. It had been possible to do that then, in a day of occasional slow-trotting horses and buggies, and the camera was aimed at an angle to one side, toward the sidewalk and the big houses beyond it, looking down the walk for several hundred feet. The old walk, there in the foreground under the great trees, appeared to be at least 6 feet wide, spacious enough easily for a family to walk down its 4 or 5 abreast, as families did in those times, walk together down the sidewalks under the trees. And beyond the walk, widely separated and set far back across the fine old lawns, rose the great houses, the 10, 12, and 14-room family houses, 2 or more stories high and with attics above them for children to play in and discover the relics of childhoods before them. Their windows were tall, and they were framed on the outside with ornamented wood, and in the solid construction of every one of those lost houses in that ancient photograph there had been left over the time, skill, money, and inclination to decorate their eaves with scrollwork, to finish a job with craftsmanship and pride, and time, too, to build huge wide porches on which families sat on summer evenings with palm leaf fans. Far down that lovely, tree-sheltered street, out of focus and indistinct, walked the retreating figure of a long-skirted, puff-sleeved woman, her summer parasol open at her back. Of the thousands of long-dead girls it might have been, I knew this could not be Helen Worley. Yet it wasn't completely impossible, I told myself. This was a street, precisely as I saw it now, down which she must have often walked, and I let myself think that yes, this was she. Maybe I live in what is for me the wrong time, and I was filled now with the most desperate yearning to be there, on that peaceful street, to walk off past the edges of the scene on the printed page before me, into the old and beautiful Brooklyn of long ago, and to draw near and overtake that bobbing parasol in the distance, and then turn and look into the face of the girl who held it. I worked that evening at home, sitting at my desk with a can of beer on the floor beside me, But once more, now Helen Elizabeth Worley was in my mind. I worked steadily all evening. It was around 12:30 when I finished. 11 handwritten pages which I'd get typed at the office on Monday. Then I opened a little center desk drawer into which I put a supply of rubber bands and paper clips, took out a clip and fastened the pages together, and sat back in my chair, taking a swallow of beer. The little center desk drawer stood half open as I'd left it, and then as my eyes fell on it, I realized suddenly that of course it too must have another secret drawer behind it. I hadn't thought of that. It simply hadn't occurred to me. The week before, my interest and excitement over the letter I'd found behind the first drawer of the row, and I'd been too busy all week to think of it since. But now I set down my beer, pulled the center drawer all the way out, reached behind it and found a little groove in the smooth wood I touched. Then I brought out the second secret little drawer. I'll tell you what I think, what I'm certain of, though I don't claim to be speaking scientifically. I don't think science has a thing to do with it. The night is a strange time. Things are different at night, as every human being knows somewhere deep inside him. And I think this: Brooklyn has changed over 7 decades. It is no longer the same place at all. But here and there still are little islands, isolated remnants of the way things once were, and the Worcester Postal Substation is one of them. It has changed really not at all, and I think that at night, late at night, the world asleep, and the sounds of things as they are now are nearly silent, and the sight of things as they are now is vague in the darkness, the boundary between here and then wavers. At certain moments and places it fades. I think that there in the dimness of the old Worcester post office, in the dead of night, lifting my letter to Helen Worley toward the old brass door of the letter drop, I think that I stood on one side of that slot in the year 1959, and I dropped my letter properly stamped, written and addressed in the ink and on the very paper of Helen Worley's youth, into the Brooklyn of 1882 on the other side of that worn old slot. I believe that. I'm not even interested in proving it, but I believe it, because now from that second secret little drawer I brought out the paper I found in it, opened it, and then rust black ink on yellowing old paper I read. Please, oh please, who are you? Where can I reach you? Your letter arrived today in the second morning post, and I have wandered the house and garden ever since in an agony of excitement. I cannot conceive how you saw my letter in its secret place, but since you did, perhaps you will see this one too. Oh, tell me your letter is no hoax or cruel joke. Willie, if it is you, if you have discovered my letter and think to deceive your sister with a prank, I pray you to tell me. But if it is not, I now address someone who has truly responded to my most secret hopes. Do not longer keep me ignorant of who and where you are, for I too, and I confess it willingly, long to see you, and I too feel, and am most certain of it, that if I could know you, I would love you. It is impossible for me to think otherwise. I must hear from you again. I shall not rest until I do. I remember most sincerely Helen Elizabeth Worley. After a long time, I opened the first little drawer of the old desk and took out the pen and ink I'd found there and a sheet of the notepaper. For minutes then, the pen in my hand, I sat there in the night, staring down at the empty paper on the desktop. Finally then, I dipped the pen into the old ink and wrote, Helen, my dear, I don't know how to say this so it will seem even comprehensible to you, but I do exist, here in Brooklyn, less than 3 blocks from where you now read this, in the year 1959. We are separated not by space, but by the years which lie between us. Now, I own the desk which you once had, and at which you wrote the note I found in it. Helen, all I can tell you is that I answered that note, mailed it late last night at the old Worcester station, and that somehow it reached you, as I hope this will too. This is no hoax. Can you imagine anyone playing a joke that cruel? I live in a Brooklyn within sight of your house that you cannot imagine. It is a city whose streets are now crowded with wheeled vehicles propelled by engines. It is a city extending far beyond the limits you know, with a population of millions, so crowded there is hardly room any longer for trees. From my window as I write, I can see, across Brooklyn Bridge, which has hardly changed from the way you too can see it now, Manhattan Island, and rising from it are the lighted silhouettes of stone and steel buildings, more than 1,000 feet high. You must believe me. I live, I exist, 77 years after you read this, and with the feeling that I have fallen in love with you. I sat for some moments staring at the wall, trying to figure out how to explain something I was certain was true. Then I wrote, Helen, there are 3 secret drawers in our desk. Into the first you put only the letter I found. You can now add something to that drawer and hope that it will reach me. For I have already opened that drawer and found only the letter you put there. Nothing else can now come through the years to me in that drawer, for you cannot now alter what you have already done. Into the second drawer in 1882 you put the note which lies before me, which I found when I opened that drawer a few minutes ago. You put nothing else into it, and now that too cannot be changed. But I haven't opened the third drawer, Helen, not yet. It is the last way you can reach me, and the last time. I will mail this as I did before, then wait. In a week I will open the last drawer. Jake Belknap. It was a long week. I worked, I kept busy at daytime, but at night I thought of hardly anything but the third drawer in my desk. I was terribly tempted to open it earlier, telling myself that whatever might lie in it had been put there decades before and must be there now. But I wasn't sure, and I waited. Then late at night, a week to the hour after I'd mailed my second letter at the old Worcester post office, I pulled out the third drawer, reached in, brought out the last little secret drawer which lay behind it. My hand was actually shaking, and for a moment I couldn't bear to look directly. Something lay in the drawer, and I turned my head away. Then I looked. I'd expect a long letter, very long, of many pages, her last communication with me, and full of everything she wanted to say. But there was no letter at all. It was a photograph about 3 inches square, of faded sepia in color, mounted on heavy stiff cardboard, and with the photographer's name in tiny gold script down in the corner. Brunner and Holland, Parisian Photography, Brooklyn, New York. The photograph showed the head and shoulders of a girl in a high-necked, dark dress, with a cameo brooch at the collar. Her dark hair was swept tightly back, covering the ears in a style which no longer suits our ideas of beauty. But the stark severity of that dress and hairstyle couldn't spoil the beauty of the face that smiled out at me from that old photograph. It wasn't beautiful in any classic sense, I suppose. The brows were unplucked and somewhat heavier than we are used to, but it is the soft warm smile of her lips, and her eyes, large and serene as she looks out at me over the years, that make Helen Elizabeth Worley a beautiful woman. Across the bottom of her photograph she had written, I will never forget. And as I sat there at the old desk staring at what she had written, I understood that of course that was all there was to say. What else? On this, the last time, as she knew that she'd ever be able to reach me. It wasn't the last time, though. There was one final way for Helen Worley to communicate with me over the years, and it took me a long time, as it must have taken her to realize it. Only a week ago, on my 4th day of searching, I finally found it. It was late in the evening, and the sun was almost gone, when I found the old headstone among all the others stretching off in rows under the quiet trees. And then I read the inscription etched in the weathered old stone. Helen Elizabeth Worley, 1861-1934. Under this were the words, I never forgot, and neither will I.